Distinguished guests, we welcome you to our fourth and last session of the day, From Regulation to Enablement, Infrastructure Policy for the Digital Economy, to discuss how infrastructure policies can move from traditional regulation to active enablement, supporting growth, innovation, and collaboration across the digital economy. We are pleased to invite our moderator, Faiz Abu Awad, Policy Director of MENA at GSMA, and his distinguished guests.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jas Shearer, and I'll be moderating the next session. I work as a Senior Director in the Infrastructure Group for GSMA, and the theme for today's session is Regulation for Sustainable Digital Development. The context for this is that we all know that the lack of connectivity and inclusive access to adoption of digital services can be a significant barrier to socio-economic development. We need to have the right regulatory and economic incentives to stimulating and incentivizing investment so that they can be deployed in a way that will foster social welfare and economic growth, contributing to a better digital future for everybody. Our best practice guidelines advocate for policies that encourage investment in digital infrastructure and streamline administrative processes. We think that there's no compromise and no conflict between consumer protection, promoting competition, and incentivizing investment. These operationalize all of the existing ITU G5 guidelines for best practices for fifth generation regulations, namely a collaborative framework and a principles-based approach to regulation. Our GSMA's digital infrastructure policy and regulation team has been conducting well-received studies in collaboration with GSMA on assessing policy readiness for mobile investment. We did a similar exercise for the APAC region last year, and we're due to publish the findings of a study for the MENA region in the MWC event in Doha in November later this year. GSMA assessed infrastructure readiness for a number of markets in the Middle East and is working on a cross-cutting study into policy issues. The session today will bring insights and questions from our guests and a guest panelist to explore these issues in further depth. GSMA, of course, is a non-profit advocacy group for the mobile industry. We are here to ensure that the mobile industry is incentivized to make the investments that will benefit not just the wider economy, but also maximize and enhance consumer welfare over the longer term. Now, without any further ado, I would like to hand you over to GSMA's Chief Regulatory Officer, Mr. John Gusti, who will provide a short presentation on igniting mobile investment for the digital economy.
$5.8 billion. That's how many people the mobile industry connects around the world today. And $6.5 trillion US dollars. That's how much the industry is contributing to the economy, and that was last year alone. So excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be here with all of you because you are the very people who help make this possible. And of course, to be here to celebrate the 25th Global Symposium for Regulators. Congratulations to the International Telecommunications Union on reaching this really important milestone. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our host, the Communications, Space, and Technology Commission of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Across the world, mobile is empowering billions with mobile internet access, and unlocking essential resources, such as access to online education and healthcare. Mobile is enabling transformative technologies, from autonomous vehicles in manufacturing plants to delivery services using drones. And mobile is facilitating services like early warning systems that are protecting properties and saving lives. Today, almost every industry relies on mobile industry and services. And as artificial intelligence emerges as a transformational force, mobile is laying the foundation upon which it will function, thrive, and grow. But all of this requires investment. And here is the challenge that all of us face. As you can see, $244 billion is spent on connectivity infrastructure every year. Of this, about half is on consumer and user devices. The other half is on the critical infrastructure, the backbone, the core, and access networks that enable today's digital services. But who pays for this infrastructure? Mobile operators pay 85% of the total. Yet our industry is only a small part of the broader share of the economic benefit from that investment, which impacts the ability to return the investment back into the very infrastructure that we all depend on. Players across the digital ecosystem, from cloud service companies to content and application providers, rely on this infrastructure. And the investment demand that we keep putting into it only keeps growing. Over the last 10 years, the mobile industry has spent about $500 billion on spectrum. It's invested $1.1 trillion on CapEx. And to keep up with the demand that I mentioned, we will invest another $1.3 trillion in CapEx over the next 5 years. Let's be clear, this level of investment is absolutely necessary. We need to ensure that our networks can keep up with growing consumer and enterprise demands. But we must ensure that the other big players within the digital ecosystem are sharing the responsibility for building our national digital futures. Without this, how can we meet our future connectivity needs? Global 5G deployment, rising digital consumption, AI, they're all tremendous opportunities, but they're also placing a strain and challenge on networks. By the end of this decade, mobile data traffic is projected to triple. And add to this, in some cases, outdated regulatory frameworks, and we see challenges facing all of us ahead. I think Jazz mentioned the work that we've done, and I think if we look specifically here in the Middle East and North Africa, we see a diverse connectivity ecosystem. It includes both emerging and advanced markets. And I think this table helps show some of the pain points that are faced by investors, those that we in the mobile community depend to help us build the networks, and those that you in government rely on to make sure that you have the necessary national infrastructure in place. And a red dot indicates where there is scope for policy improvements. Extensive QoS regulation, sector-specific levies, restrictions on deploying fiber and spectrum sharing. And while this table shows countries in the MENA region, many of these trends go beyond and are global as well. I think the table also reinforces the critical role that regulators and policymakers play. A positive and sustainable investment environment is the first step for governments if they want to unlock the full potential of their digital economies. And once we agree on that point, then we can ask ourselves, how do we achieve this? How do we achieve this together across government, across industry, across industries? And I think while there's no one size fits all, the research shows 4 areas of focus worth considering: fiscal policy, regulatory fairness, operational flexibility, and inconsistent renewal frameworks. All of these can erode or delay confidence in infrastructure projects. And for investment certainty, spectrum licensing is really key when you talk about mobile. The need to be technology neutral, the need for longer license durations, and clear presumptions around renewal. I think when we look across the region, I think we see Jordan standing out in this area with 25-year licenses that provide the long-term visibility needed to plan and to invest effectively. This also brings me to the other point of government facilitation. Quite simply, without government support, without government facilitation, much of what we discussed today will fail or will not reach its full potential. There's no question about that. governments play a really vital role, promoting the digital economy, incentivizing investment, and supporting collaboration. Public services are a key opportunity area, and online government portals are increasingly common in many countries, whether it be Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia. So ladies and gentlemen, as we look at this, we need to recognize that connectivity infrastructure is really the foundation for all of what we're trying to do, for the internet ecosystem enabling all players across it to thrive. To sustain it, we need a regulatory environment that encourages investment, as well as continued innovation. And of course, every market is unique, and you all from governments and regulators across the world know the distinctions and the unique factors of your market. But I believe firmly that when you focus in these three areas, you can find the solution that works for you and works for your industries. And I believe will help bring us to a smarter, more connected, and more prosperous future for all of us and for all of our citizens. So thank you for giving me the platform today, and I want to thank the CST and the GSR for creating this opportunity. It's now my opportunity to reintroduce Jas Shira, who will be bringing together a platform panel around from regulation to enablement, driving digital economies, with some really key voices in the discussion and debate. And I'm hopeful that the discussion here at GSR is part of a continuing dialogue that we have between industry and government. We can continue these at MWC Kigali, MWC Doha, MWC Barcelona, as well as in other ITU platforms and other government platforms. So again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see all of you. And Jas, I welcome you back to the stage.
That was a very insightful set of slides, and it's given us plenty of food for thought. The size of the numbers themselves are something that jump out of those presentations and reminds us of just the scale of the investment challenge, and the importance of the communications industry, not just in connecting people, but in underpinning a lot of the new technologies nowadays, such as AI, such as cloud infrastructure, which are getting most of the press. But all of these require a sound, reliable, secure, ubiquitous physical infrastructure underneath them in order for them to work and to fulfill their potential. Today, we're going to have three panelists representing all aspects of the wider mobile and digital ecosystem. First of all, it's my pleasure to have Chairman Ramusi from ICASA, the South African regulator. He's got more than 3 decades of ICT experience, spanning both the private and public sector, and he's an expert in extending ICT matters, ICT coverage to underserved and rural areas. Chairman, please. Second, I would like to introduce Paul Garrett, who has very kindly agreed to step in at short notice after our original panelist, Carla Rosotto from the World Bank Group, was unfortunately unable to attend GSR due to personal matters. Paul, who is known to many of you already, he's got over 25 years of experience in telecoms and technology law and policy. He's the founder of the Vernonberg Group, and he's also led Microsoft's Airbound initiative, which will encompass 100 projects in over 20 countries to extend last mile expert. He's an expert and passionate about universal access, and he's represented the wireless industry before both the FCC and US Congress. Paul? And our third guest today is Khaled Hegacy. He's the COO of E&D International. He's also known to a lot of you already. He's been on a couple of the ITU sessions already. He's worked internationally across MENA for both E&D and the Vodafone Group. And he's also a board member of the Samina Telecoms Council. So he's well versed in understanding from both an advocacy group and from an operational experience, some of the issues that operators are facing. So Khalid, please, sorry. I just want to start off the session because when I came to Saudi Arabia to work in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and at that time, my experience both in the UK and Saudi Arabia was that the COVID pandemic really shifted thinking amongst policymakers, not just in the regulatory community, but in government and the legislative community about what mobile connectivity and mobile infrastructure means. And since then time, it's really become treated more like an essential utility in a similar way to water and electricity. And it's a broader public policy importance for in the areas of healthcare and education became very apparent at the time. And it's become more apparent ever since because of its, as I mentioned earlier on, its critical role in underpinning a lot of the new technologies that are so important to the world now, not just in terms of economic growth, but also in reducing poverty and increasing social welfare. Chairman, I would like to start with you first of all, based on your experience, because you've done 2 stints in the regulatory side of defence in the public sector, one in the very early days of the industry and one more recently. And in between, you have a lot of experience in the private sector. What was your, how do you recall the changing in perception of the mobile industry as a result of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, thank you very much, and once more, good afternoon. Yeah, I must say that when one looks at the journey that where we started in the early 90s as well, mobility has always been something that we embraced because, as you know, as communities, I mean, I grew up in a village where moving from one village to another, if you didn't have any means of transport, you would rely on some traditional way of talking to your family members. And with the advent of mobile at the time, it made it very possible instantly to create that communication amongst ourselves. Now, what we then observed, obviously, during COVID, it was now a recognition that when you talk of interconnecting communities, it became something that was not, it's one of the basic things that you needed, because if remotely you needed to engage, the means of communication in the modes of mobile became the norm. And we've seen how we managed as communities to integrate and collaborate, where the pandemic necessitated us to identify innovative way of living, because it's something that we never expected. Now you can imagine that in the absence of regulations that enabled communication, enablement of communities to interact was not going to be possible. So by just putting together rules of communication through regulations, made it then very possible so that business, private sector, government can interact. So the enablement came through regulations. Whereas in the past, communication, as much as it was one of the basic requirements, if you don't have set of rules, you cannot enable communities to interact. So the experience, I think, from what one has seen in the past has been that from regulation to enablement, the advantage is, as regulators, we've made it sure that whatever infrastructure that are being built, you don't build infrastructure just for your own self, but it's there to make sure that you bring communities together. And yeah, that's what one has seen in that advent of communication as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Khalid, if I can come to you next, I think, did you sense a change in operators' self-perception because of their becoming more aware of their social responsibility for providing connectivity to citizens and to connecting the unconnected, stimulated by what a core central role it played during the pandemic and the different perceptions that both the mobile industry and the wider ecosystem has had since then?
Well, I think the easiest way to see how humanity has dealt with the pandemic is to imagine if the pandemic had happened in 1987. So I think life would have come to a standstill. All the investment, all the plans for connectivity, for encouraging growth in internet usage, for applications, for everything, was fast forwarded tremendously. So e-commerce, online, e-commerce, fintech, all the online payments, work from home, all of these things were made possible by the investments that the operators had made, by the future-looking plans that the operators had, and it paid off very quickly and very well for the operators in a very short time. So, and it drove the habit in the customers, in the consumers. So the usage has increased geometrically and continued to increase. So companies saw the benefit of working from home on productivity. They did not stop the working from home after the pandemic. So this continued. E-commerce and e-payments and all the apps that people got used to using during the pandemic, they continued to use and they increased their usage. So it kind of did a leapfrog on the progress. And of course it showed the operators and the regulators and the governments how the connectivity and the growth in the uptake in the usage is very crucial and very important for the growth of the GDP. So,
thank you. Paul, you earlier on at the ITU session, you were presenting the report on connecting humanity. I guess the name of the report suggests the nature of the sense of mission, I guess, if I can put it that way. The original report, of course, was done in the G20 when it was hosted in Riyadh, and that was just shortly after I first joined CST here. What are the key messages that you want to convey from the report about the role that mobile infrastructure and mobile connectivity and mobile affordability plays in terms of the enhancing social welfare?
Well, first of all, thank you for making me a last-minute addition to the panel. I'm sorry I don't have a shaved head like the rest of the guys. I didn't realize I would have taken care of that as part of this.
Fine.
not really something good shows.
So thank you very much, and this is a great event, and thank you to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for hosting us here, and for ITU and for GSMA for inviting me to join the panel. So yeah, I mean, your question, sort of 5 years ago, the original report in 2020, right at the beginning of COVID, and the report we just released yesterday, 5 years later. And there was also a report that I worked on for ITU shortly after that called Connect to Recover, which was sort of in the early days of COVID and trying to figure out what we all needed to do in order to recover and to be more resilient. And the mindset definitely has shifted over the last 5 years in terms of connectivity, both mobile and fixed. Now, widely recognized as an essential service that everyone needs to have. You mentioned education. I mean, recall that, there were about 2.6 billion school children that were sent home from school at the beginning of COVID. Most of those kids didn't have connectivity at home around the world. Just personally, I have 4 kids, and 2 were at university at the time. 1 was at boarding school and 1 was at home, and all 4 of them, came home. And that was quite a transition as a family. But fortunately, we had connectivity. I can't imagine what it would have been like if we did not. In terms of mobile and the role that mobile plays, and I would say it's more than just mobile. It's wireless. Really a critical role. And one of the things we sort of in the paper that was just released yesterday, we look at the 2030 aspirational targets, UN ITUs, and ITU's aspirational targets for connectivity, and there are a variety of those technology targets, universality targets, and others. And there are goals, for example, that for smartphones to be affordable enough for everybody, for both mobile and fixed services to be affordable, with meaningful connectivity, not just basic connectivity. Gender-related issues to be addressed. So there's a variety of issues there that we look at. We looked at the gaps, we looked at the cost to close those gaps, and we have a lot of discussion in the paper on case studies, sort of things that are working, things that are not working, and this idea of digital inclusion transformative projects. In terms of the role that wireless plays, we did actually, fortunately, we were able to work with GSMA and got access to some of the great data that you guys have on coverage, and looked at, built a pretty complex model looking at what it would cost to extend infrastructure to all the unserved locations around the world through a hybrid network approach, fiber, fixed wireless, and satellite in very rural areas. And obviously, and on the fixed wireless side, we focused on 4G fixed wireless services as a proxy, although there are other kinds of fixed wireless services as well. Coverage, 91.7% of the world's population is now within reach of a 4G network, which is fantastic. But there are folks that are not, and it disproportionately, those who are not disproportionately impacts places like Africa and other regions with a high percentage of rural and lower income users. So in those rural areas in particular, fixed wireless is going to be the most cost-economic solution, most cost-effective solution to bring access to those places. So that's on the infrastructure side. On the adoption side, we have to address affordability gaps. We've got to deal with not just on the services side, but also on devices, and the report goes into a lot of detail on that. And then beyond affordability, even when service is free, there are people who still don't sign up for a variety of reasons. So things like digital skills and those kinds of programs are critically important as well. And we'll talk about that in the report.
Great. You brought up a number of interesting concepts there, and the phrase you used was meaningful connectivity. So I think there's a lot of attention rightfully goes on connecting the unconnected, but there's actually a far bigger segment of people who are covered but don't have any sort of meaningful connectivity. And a lot of that comes down to issues of digital skills, which you mentioned, but a lot of it also comes down to issues of affordability. And one of the key pain points for our members, as we saw in John's presentation earlier on, is that there's a very high fiscal burden that is imposed on mobile operators in the way of not just general taxation, which is horizontal and applies to the whole sector, but sector-specific levies and taxes. And in some countries, this goes as high as about 40% of all the revenues that mobile operators make. Suffice to say that it's an obvious truism that if you are paying more and more in taxes, you have less money to invest in the network and to upgrade the network. But also, I think from a general investor perspective, when they look at some aspects of the industry, which is very capital intensive, it goes in. You said 97% of the population of the world is covered. So there's a huge dollar sign bill for the remaining 3-4%. But even for the 97%, just to upgrade the network, next generation infrastructure, facilitate new use cases, that itself is also got a huge dollar bill running the hundreds of billions of dollars. And a lot of operators are going to be struggling to make the case to the investors of making this investment when for example, ARPU is flat or declining, and they cannot see how they can get a return on their investment that is going to cover the cost of capital. And a lot of people always overlook that mobile operators are commercial operators, commercial companies like anybody else. The investors who invest in them have got other options as well to invest in. So in terms of how to make the case for funding and upgrading networks such that the business case adds up, what would be your key insights that you have gathered from a lot of the Connecting Humanity work and a lot of the other work that you've done over the years in making sure that both the underserved have meaningful connectivity as well as last mile access to those who are unserved?
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's 91.7%, not 97%.
Okay.
It's close enough. And it's a very broad question, and there's a lot of answers to it.
Yeah.
When I worked at CTIA many years ago, we used to talk about the taxes that are placed on the mobile industry and the telecom industry in general being equivalent to the kinds of taxes that are imposed upon things like tobacco and alcohol, so-called sin taxes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like when you're providing telecommunications services or accessing it, you're being sinful, but for whatever reason, government sometimes seems to think that that's what's happening, and you should be taxed as if you are. So taxes definitely, and the other problem with a lot of these taxes is they are regressive. So they end up impacting lower income users more than higher income users. And take the example of smartphones. One of the projects that we feature in the report is one being led by GSMA and the Handset Alliance to try to come up with a 4G capable smartphone or smartphones that cost as little as $20 US a month. Today there are devices that cost as little as $30 a month, which is amazing enough. But getting it down to $20 a month would mean that smartphones are affordable for an additional 600 million people around the world, which is a huge difference maker, and doesn't involve government having to intervene and provide subsidy, for example, for the devices to be affordable for that group of people. But if you add on top of that $20 cost, taxes, import duties. Those additional dollars mean a lot to someone who's at the lower end of the income pyramid to be able to afford that. So these things have real world impacts. Obviously, governments need money to run, and they need to raise funds, but they do need to think about the impacts of those. And I don't think their intention is to prevent, for example, lower income users from being able to afford their devices and their connectivity.
Right. If I can come to you, Chairman. I think in South Africa, I believe earlier this year, you reduced or eliminated the so-called luxury tax on handsets under a certain price point. I believe it was 2,500 Rand, if memory serves me correctly.
Yeah, that's correct.
In South Africa, you of course have a development plan, the NDP, in which you've got explicit goals of reducing social inequality and reducing poverty. Was it that helped you make this progressive step, bold step, which would, in the short term, reduce revenue for the Treasury, but will have will leverage longer term benefits to increase social welfare? How did you manage to convince people both within ICASA and the government that this was the right step to take?
Yeah, I think perhaps maybe just to give a reflection, we have what you call the National Development Plan 2030, and it's a plan that has painted the future of South Africa in terms of what we desire to see in 2030. Amongst other things is to have every South African to have access to broadband services. And when you talk of broadband, it must be based on a secured platform affordable, scalable, because as you know, in terms of growth, you don't want to be providing anything that is static. Now, to craft that program, because, you know, we're talking about regulation to enablement. Now, once you enable communities to interact, one of the biggest growth is to see the economy growing, because you need to make sure that communities interact amongst themselves. Now, as a regulator, we're coming from an era. Earlier on, you spoke about specific sector issues. Now, we recognize that nowadays we don't talk about sectors, we talk about cross-sectional. Now, the NDP, amongst others, then recognizes that you need to bring all the sectors together because we're working towards a digitally enabled environment. Now, in order to do that, it starts then with your basic. You need to have an infrastructure that is robust, scalable. So when you look at infrastructure, digital economy, customer-centric type services, the issue of cost then comes into play. Because you don't want to be building an infrastructure which you don't have any uptake. So our strategy and our approach in South Africa was to say, let's identify what are the main inhibitors when it comes to cost. One of the issues, obviously, is this mobility. We've got units. And because most of them are not localized, you import. Then the issue is, if you really want to have an inclusive society, how then best can you bring communities into the communication mainstream? This, amongst many others, knowing that when you talk of broadband, you need a smartphone. Now, when you talk of a smartphone, you're looking at innovation. I must say that because of the agility of our government, as an authority working with the Ministry of Communication and Digital Technology, there was then a desire to say, let's identify an incentive of bringing all the smartphones in our country. Then one of the incentives then was to say, how do we then reduce taxation? And I'm glad to inform the world that as a journey towards achieving the issue of cost reduction, we have these mobiles, less than 2,500, which are not subjected to tax. So it gives me, as a citizen, as a user, at least leverage to get into the mainstream. But from a regulatory point of view, any country, we need to find ways of generating revenue. Availing spectrum, in many instances, will require spectrum, depending what type of networks you build. We've gone through a program in South Africa 2 years ago, 2022, where we auction spectrum. We've collected in the region of 14 billion for the fiscus of government, and it was one method, especially for the mobiles, to give them leverage to start utilizing the precious spectrum that people talk of, IMT, broadband. So the NDP 2030, as I've said, because it's a journey, from an authority, we've now used regulation to see how we can enable the future of inclusivity so that the unconnected can be brought into the connected world. So that's the kind of contribution as an authority that we've done, and that's what we continue to do.
Khalid, if I can come to you, a similar theme. You're the E&E International Director, so your responsibilities for all the other parts of the group outside the UAE. The other parts of the group, you cover a mixture of countries which some are we call developing, some are more developed, some are more advanced infrastructure than others. When it comes to this issue of dealing with regulators and dealing with governments on making the case for, to borrow the chairman's phrase, creating the right incentive structure for mobile network operators to invest by taking a longer term view and reducing the sector specific fiscal burden on handsets, which you've already mentioned, but also on mobile services themselves. Have you found that the audience for that in countries is getting more receptive? Is there any sort of arguments that you find are getting more traction? How would you make the case for them to take the longer term view of both for the growth of the economy, but also for increasing social welfare?
Well, making the case is very difficult. I mean, especially when it's so obvious that countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, countries who have made it easier for the industry to grow, but at the same time put more onus on them for investing and for developing the market and benefiting the customers. But even if we go to a country like Morocco, where they have a scheme they call it pay or play. So instead of just giving the universal service obligation money to a US fund, to a universal service fund, and then wait for the government to disperse them, because you still have countries, especially in Africa, we still have over $250 million who have not been dispersed yet. So this could solve a lot of issues, but because of the nature of the funds and the difficulty it is to offer transparency and visibility in many countries. But in Morocco, you're offered either to pay the money or to spend it yourself. So when the operators are spending it themselves, they are building faster and building quicker and giving the benefit to the customers more. The other thing is that when governments put sector-specific taxes, they need to realize that they're not treating the telecommunication industry as a regular industry. A regular industry should pay the regular corporate tax. Any dollar extra on the corporate tax is a sector-specific tax, and this is a dollar less than the money that would have been spent on investment, right? So when you go into things like overtaxing handsets with the good intention of developing the local handset assembly industry in your country, the local assembly targets more and more the 2G handsets, the feature phones, the more affordable ones. And at the end, it makes it difficult for the operators to do something like the 2G sunset, because you still have 50% of the customers in a country still using 2G, and you want to promote a 4G handset. So it is counterintuitive, really, because it's a sin. It's treated like tobacco or gambling industry, while at the same time it's an important tool to develop the GDP of the country. So it is very difficult to drive the message when it's so obvious. So, but you keep trying to show it to them, especially when they are also not only taxing you from the beginning, but they're also taking a large revenue share. So the longer term would be that you are getting a revenue share, so grow the revenue so that your revenue share will become bigger. Wait for the egg to hatch, wait for the chick to grow so that it can lay more eggs, rather than make a soup from the chick.
Yeah. It's a great analogy. In fact, I think that GSMA did a study on Eurasia. It's either early this year or late last year, in terms of simulating the impact of reducing the fiscal burden on both handsets and on mobile services. And the results were that, as you said, that the solution is obvious because it leads to more growth in the economy and therefore more taxation revenues. But we were quite surprised at the speed with which the net contributions to exchequer become positive. So if you reduce the tax burden, it's only in year one that the exchequer will get less revenues than they would have had with the base case of keeping the exchequer, the taxes high. In year two, they're already moving to the black. It's already positive, and it gets better and better. So, to use that analogy, don't make the soup from the egg. Let it grow, and it is obvious. But I guess the fiscal hole that it leaves for some countries in their budgets, when especially nowadays when a lot of countries are struggling to grow, and there's fiscal holes in their in their sort of books. It takes quite an enlightened and progressive and longer term perspective to go for the obvious solution. I think we've also mentioned funding, because I think we also have to acknowledge that in certain areas, even with a progressive and enlightened regulatory framework, there'll be certain
investment cases that just won't add up in certain rural areas. You mentioned earlier on, Paul, that you take a hybrid technology approach, and some technologies might be more cost effective. We've also heard from other sessions in the ITU that satellite can provide some sort of, or certainly some sort of coverage backstop, even if it might not meet the capacity for what you call meaningful connectivity. In terms of meeting the funding shortfall, what can governments do to help make the cases in rural areas? In particular, I went to the session that you were on yesterday in the ITU, and there was a very interesting example in the Amazon basin that I thought was a good case study, and maybe could benefit from a little bit more publicity as well.
Yeah, that's the Connected North project in Brazil. I mean, to me, it's kind of an unbelievable data point, but the Amazon is more than the size of Europe and has only 20 million people living in it. This puts northern part of Brazil. So that's an incredible undertaking to bring connectivity to that kind of a place. And so what the government of Brazil has done in partnership with network operators is embark upon this project to extend infrastructure through the rivers, subfluvian fiber. It's a term that I hadn't heard of before I started working on this paper. But so fiber backbone networks up through the rivers in the Amazon, and then extending on land into the communities that are along those rivers. And what the government has done is instead of the usual taking money from spectrum auctions and just putting it into the treasury, they're using the proceeds from spectrum auctions to fund this project. So the government to basically help the industry make the business case to bring connectivity into these unserved communities in the Amazon is covering essentially the CapEx costs for the fiber network. And then the network operators cover the OpEx, right, through the services that they provide. So their revenues from operations should be able to cover their OpEx, and the government is covering the CapEx. And so far, I mean, this is an ongoing project, but so far it's been quite successful. And then alongside the infrastructure funding, the government has also been supporting other types of projects to increase adoption. So digital skills programming and device refurbishment programs. So taking devices that businesses no longer need and refurbishing those so school children can use them. So addressing both the infrastructure gap as well as the adoption gap in a large, comprehensive way.
If I can add an example here, a good example from Egypt is from the Universal Services Fund, is that they actually, from the fund, they cover the CapEx and they cover the OpEx for 5 years or until the site becomes economically viable, whichever is shorter. So they even cover the OpEx for up to 5 years. But this is coming from the universal service obligations, which comes from the fund that the operators have already put in place.
Yeah, okay. In South Africa, you've also got a universal service fund that you've been using in a forward-looking, progressive manner to connect the underserved as well.
Yeah, it's actually the same model, and I think as an incentive, it's actually meant to say that in underserved, we'll get a subsidy if it's an infrastructure expansion in areas which are defined as underserved. But I think maybe just to point out one issue in terms of that kind of an incentive. Of late, as regulators, we've noticed that if one really wants to accelerate infrastructure in underserved, the issue of CAPEX becomes a key issue. Where do you buy the technology from? So I know that when we talk here, and sometimes the OEMs, we never get to engage directly with them. But I believe that if in the value chain of service provisioning, you bring the original equipment manufacturers into the discussion, because ultimately, if your capital cost, even if it's in rural, one will still want to get good quality of services, because the word underserved, sometimes it's underscored. You think that people who are in rural areas must just get a third grade, whereas they still have to get the very same first grade like in the urban areas. But as an incentive, yes, South Africa, we do have the Universal Service Fund. We're in a process right now, recognizing that the future of obligations, it's not just only about connectivity. There's issue of content creation, digital literacy. So as part of infrastructure rollout, we are mindful that it's very easy to can expand a network. But if those that you are building the network for don't know what that network is meant to do, there won't be any take-up. So training becomes key so that they know that this broadband network, how is it going to change their lives? Because regulation, as I said, as an enablement, it must be seen again as a transformation to you. The cross-sectional sectors that we see earlier on, you asked the question in terms of sector-specific. When we licensed our first MNOs 30 years ago, we never thought that by today, the MNOs will now be banks. They will be insurance companies. So now you're finding a situation where if I have to regulate, now the question is, who is an MNO today? What should be the posture of me as a regulator? So even when it comes to incentives for rural, because we're going into a digital economy, transformation requires everybody now to be digitally connected. But the issue of security, trust, because when you enable people, you need to make sure that the infrastructure you provide is secured. So those are the issues. But yeah, the fund, as it was traditionally, not only just to expand networks. I think as regulators, we need to look at an innovative way to say, what other aspects do we bring into that fund? The issue of fintech, we've seen worldwide in terms of fraud. There's quite a lot of happening in that environment. So the question is, perhaps maybe this is an opportunity for local innovation, especially coming from the African continent. Gone are the days when you are becoming a consumer. You need to be a developer as well. So the fund needs to be part of a developmental focus so that you do things for yourself. But yeah, we do have a model of that nature, but we're looking at how we can transform and make it meaningful as just opposed to be a subsidy.
Can I just add to Chairman Rome's comments? I absolutely agree. And oftentimes we always talk about the projects that worked really well, but don't necessarily talk about the ones that haven't worked quite as well. And in the early days of my work at the project level, and we saw this across Africa. The early days of bringing the internet to underserved communities and low-income communities, had this idea that we needed to bring free, Wi-Fi hotspots to the village, and that's great as a kind of a stopgap. But at the end of the day, one sort of aha moment that we had in our projects is fundamentally people all want the same things, right? So if I'm a family living in a rural community and I'm lower income, I want to be able to have connectivity at my home. I don't want to have to go to a hotspot down at the local spaza shop. And also there are safety issues around that as well. I mean, if I'm a father of girls, I don't necessarily want my daughters to have to walk down to the spaza shop, especially at night, to get their internet connectivity. I want it to be in the home. So we need to have as a target bringing connectivity to people, where they live and at a level of quality that they expect, and not water it down. the other thing I wanted to add on top of what you just said is also around the community aspect to this, and you mentioned the word trust. One of the other issues that we need to deal with is there are a lot of people around the world who don't trust government. They don't trust mobile network operators sometimes. And so you bring programs into communities and they don't want to sign up for them because they don't trust them. But community-based groups, community governments and like tribal leaders are trusted in these communities. So oftentimes it requires big multinationals and national governments to work with local community-based organizations in order to be successful in bringing these programs into these communities.
Now, I also picked up on the word trust that you mentioned it as well, because I think we often think about these different players in the wider digital ecosystem, whether it's the regulatory authorities, the mobile operators, the over-the-top providers, the cloud providers, that there's always some tension between them. But one area that they can all agree on is that it's in their common interest to create a trusted environment for consumers to use services at a time when you can pick up the papers and find out about the latest cyber hack, the latest leakage of personal data. So this is an area where it's in the interest for all parties in the ecosystem to work together. And I think this sort of is a segue into some of the other points that we saw in John's slides earlier on, which is really an adaptation of the regulatory framework from like a legacy voice world to not just a data world, but an ecosystem world. And some of the obligations that are still on mobile network operators, for example, in areas like mandating quality of service for voice-centric KPIs, such as download speeds, upload speeds, latency. This is all very much in mobile operators' own commercial interests to increase quality of service. All the surveys that both GSMA have done and the operators themselves have done is that after price, quality of service is the second largest driving factor that will determine selection of network and leaving a network. So it's in their own interest to drive quality of service. But a lot of our members are saying that some of these legacy requirements, which often involve quite a lot of manual work. This is not a case of setting up a software program and reporting. There's a lot of manual work that goes in monitoring and reporting things. And it can also distort where how they respond to customer needs, because there's lots of different customers. Some customers who, for example, will be playing games will value latency higher than others. Others will value throughput and reliability more. In South Africa, you've mentioned in previous discussions that we've had that the importance for regulators today in the data world, in the ecosystem world, is of agility. And you've also mentioned the importance of collaboration and cooperation. How would you say that you have translated that through into policies, from the way that you used to regulate both fixed and mobile operators in the past to how you approach it today?
Yeah, I think if you look at the emerging trends, the emerging trends somehow have kind of like dictated on how we should regulate the future. I'll give you an example. If you look at our social media at the moment, we are talking about multiple of applications that are being transmitted on the medium. Now, traditionally, if we look at ICASA, my institution, we've been fixated on telecoms, broadcast, and postal. But seeing that the current and the future talks of multidisciplinary sectors, it then called us to identify and recognize that there are other regulators, like in South Africa, we've got the Film and Publication Board, which mainly deals with classification of content, especially for the online. We have an information regulator that takes care of protection of personal information. Then you've got the domain name authority, which obviously when you look at a registry for all our domain names. Now we've seen a need that as a collective, without policy dictating on how we should operate, having recognized that social media is now calling all of us to work in a collaborative manner, we have actually recently established a forum of regulators and the media sector responding to the problem statement that you are seeing, because it's a cross-sectional issue. I mean, if you have to protect the young ones, the elderly, we need then to find a 360 collaborations amongst ourselves. So that's one initiative that we have already implemented in the country. Now, working closely with the policymakers, because we need to be mindful that as a country we are not living in isolation. The cross-border collaboration, because when you look at your fintechs, even then it calls that when you do transactions, how do you then protect me as a citizen when I transact cross-border? So the issue of that collaboration extends even outside my normal primary regulatory environment. So those are the advances that we have done in South Africa, and we continue to do that. And as I said, we are actually driven by what we see as emerging trends, which are calling for a partnership and working relations.
Yeah, that's interesting for the points that you raised, and I think some of the other some similar points have been raised by members of national regulatory authorities during the last couple of days, and it's important to understand their perspective as well, because they've got limited resources and an ever-expanding mandate into new areas such as cyber, AI, data protection, online harms. And you have to approach these not in isolation but holistically as an ecosystem. And the rate of change is so fast. You have to balance the long-term challenges with your everyday tasks. And I think that's what I've heard this theme come out more and more, which is this is what doesn't only make it preferential, but it makes it essential to have a more collaborative approach, and to approach it in a more flexible manner.
Yeah, it's actually, this has become the primary requirement in our business, and to sustain it, we've now extended our relationship with academia, because recognizing that even in your mobile business, knowledge, if it's limited in what you do, it becomes a problem. So you need to have a sustainable program.
Yeah.
So by bringing academia into the mainstream through curriculum development, and it's something that we're doing with our universities as a regulator, so that all generations to come, collaboration shouldn't just be a term that we speak about, but it must be something in practice. So we do have a sustainable program behind this collaboration that I've just shared with you. But of importance, as much as we talk government trust, you need to have that direct relationship with your policymaker. Because, in the absence of policy support, a political will, as a regulator, we find that at times that's where you have collusion. But working with the private sector, academia, and most importantly, the unions, the social partners can actually turn around things if they don't understand the regulations and the industry that you regulate. So that's the posture that we have in the country in South Africa.
Khalid, I mean, you, as I said, you got responsibility for a portfolio of countries in your group, and as we saw from the initial MENA-wise survey that we did, that was the results of which were presented at MWC earlier this year, and which John put up on his slide. You see a range of approaches in those countries, including ones which are still quite prescriptive, with what we refer to as legacy voice obligations and KPIs in areas like QoS, and restrictions on deploying your own fiber, and others who've taken a little bit more of a forward-looking, a modernized approach. Now, do you see that it's making a real difference on the ground in those countries which have modernized their regulatory frameworks compared to the ones that haven't in terms of where you direct your investments from a group portfolio level?
Okay, on the macro level, on the countries, you can immediately see how companies that opened up and encouraged the investment in the sector, like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, are reaping the benefits of that. On the OPCO level, the thing is that whenever there is a spectrum auction, whenever there is a new license that's coming, it's always a do or die decision for the operator. If you don't, as a group, if you don't allow me as an OPCO to invest in 5G, then I will be the only operator without 5G, then I will lose market share, so it goes into a cycle where you need to put in more money to preserve value in the company that you've already put money in. It does become less and less attractive. You do have a lot more attractive other investment destinations, so every time it gets more difficult, but so far you still need to keep on pumping money to protect your investment. But on the point of the quality of services and that, there is something that the regulators can do to help in the covering of the uncovered area, or in the coverage of the remote areas, is to really look at these areas with a more convenient quality of service requirements. It's not realistic to require the same throughput or the same speeds in remote areas as in the center of the cities where the businesses are and so on. So that the investments become a little bit lower and then become a little bit easier, so that more coverage is obtained until these areas pick up and become economically viable. Then we can increase the quality of service requirements on these areas.
Yeah, and I guess that in the rural areas, I think that from the government's perspective, they're preoccupied with making sure there's no digital divide between the urban and rural areas.
Yes.
But I think they often forget that mobile operators are companies and businesses like any other business, and they have to make those investment decisions where they get a return.
And they have to get the equipment from the same. I mean, you get them from the same Huawei, Ericsson, Nokias that Vodafone Germany is getting from is the same that you're going to need in Chad or in Mali. I mean, it's the same equipment, so the same cost. And then you add all the sector-specific costs, you add all the government upfront charges, then it becomes really prohibitive.
Yeah. I guess that's where we heard earlier on, that from both Paul and the chairman, that a slightly different funding approach might be required in rural areas, especially for the on the capex side, to enable those investment decisions to be made. And to take a sort of more forward-looking approach. I think we've also just want to touch quickly on the area of digital skills as well.
Can I just jump in?
Sorry, sure, yeah.
At the risk of us not violently agreeing with each other all the time, I think on the issue of quality of service, maybe there's a little more nuance to it. I absolutely agree that regulators need to be doing everything they can in order to enable network operators to improve quality of service, expand services to places that don't have it, and densify their networks and provide better services. But I think we have to remember that regulators are their job is to regulate in the public interest and to protect the public. So they're going to want to know whether or not the services that are being delivered to citizens in their country actually are of a quality that they shouldn't be worried about it. So, I mean, at least collecting data on quality of service. I mean, I know there's a bit of a tension there. Operators never want to report that kind of information, but in a way, when you do report it and the story is good, then the regulator will get off your back and let you continue running your business. The one distinction I would make is also in the context of public funding. If you're receiving public funding from government, for example, for a universal service program to bring connectivity out to a rural community, I think it's reasonable for the government to impose some quality of service obligations on you as an operator, both speed, latency, and network uptime kind of metrics and to be able to measure and make sure that you're doing what you promised to do. So I think overall. Let's get rid of legacy regulations, but I do think there's still a role for this for the regulator.
Maybe I didn't make myself clear. I'm not saying no to have quality of service. I'm just saying you have to segregate. You have to have different quality of service requirements for rural areas than it is for downtown big cities. But you have to have quality of service and you have to monitor them and the operators have to report them and the regulator has to monitor them. But you can't expect the operator to put a very fast network in an area where there's not going to be any usage and then expect it to be economically viable.
I agree to a point. The baseline should be pretty darn good in rural areas. It doesn't necessarily have to be gigabit speed connectivity, but like 100 megabits per second, something like that would be great. And ITU's standard is 20 megabits per second for the whole planet, which is a pretty good speed. There's a funny quote from a former FCC chairman. He used to say that I'm not trying to solve the Mercedes divide. So, the fact that people might have Mercedes-Benzes doesn't, one group of people may have them doesn't mean that everyone needs to have them. But you are trying to solve for a certain level of quality for everybody so that they can participate in the economy and be able to use digital services effectively.
Yeah, I think nobody would disagree with the fact that, especially where government is putting money in or funding in, that it should ensure that it gets a return for public returns. What I would say is that GSMA has done, GSMA-I, which is our economic consultancy arm, has done some quite extensive econometric analysis in the APAC region, and it's currently doing in the MENA region, and it's looking at how government can ensure that quality of service enables consumers to make informed decisions about what networks. And what I found is that naming and shaming, for example, which is just publishing data on customer satisfaction scores or other sort of KPIs, works just as effectively as more prescriptive mandates, which is that you have to have a certain amount of
I'm not suggesting that there have to be prescriptive. I think in the context of public funding, you should have some mandates. But if someone's not taking money from the government and they're just trying to compete in the marketplace, of course they have incentives to have high quality service. Otherwise, they're dead on the water. They're not going to be competitive. I agree with you on that point.
So I just want to come back on also the area of digital skills, because I think you've mentioned this a couple of times, and I think it was in the session yesterday. Mm-hmm. But digital skills is another area where I think it could benefit from a collaborative approach, because it's in everybody's interest to ensure that there's increased trust and more people are digitally literate, more people can engage with use their smartphones to engage with all the whole smorgasbord of services covering everything from health to education to logistics and everything else as well. Mm-hmm. What would you, from all the studies that you've done in your area, what would you recommend to policymakers, and what they should do and what the correct way of going about it is, and what is ways that have perhaps not got as much traction as was envisaged?
Well, I think truthfully, the digital skills area, I think all of us can agree that it's important for people to have digital skills, and not just basic digital skills. We want people not only to know how to, do the basics, but we want people to actually be productive with the technology that they have access to. And workforce is a part of that. But in truth, the data we have on digital skills on a global level, and we saw this in the report we just did, that's probably the weakest area of all. We don't have good global data on digital skills attainment at the national level. A lot of governments don't collect that data, and therefore they don't report it to the ITU. And then the other problem that we have is that what does it mean when we're even talking about digital skills? How do you define basic digital skills? How do you define above basic, which is the structure the ITU has recently created for digital skilling. So there isn't like a harmonized approach that the world is taking on digital skilling. Governments aren't all doing the same thing and have the same criteria. So it's definitely an area that that really warrants some additional focus and work. But no disagreement on the importance of it. It's just that I think if there was a more harmonized approach to it and better data collection and reporting on it, we would have a better sense of what's successful and what's not, and also know how to be more effective in our policy interventions and investment interventions in this area.
Yeah. I mean, Khalid, as you know, GSMA has also done a lot of work, as well as the members have commissioned a lot of their own reports in this area of digital skills as well. I mean, it's obviously in the interest of the communications industry to make sure that the customers and the potential customers can engage more fully with the array of services that smartphones open up. And what sort of things do you think that mobile operators can do? Because I know we've been focusing a lot on what the regulatory authorities can do. What can mobile operators do more in this area of educating people to get more engaged with communication with digital services?
I think it's a very important point. I agree with you. It's a very important point. I don't have a ready answer on what exactly the operators should do, but I agree with you that operators should be doing something. The uptake and the learning that the customers have gone through since COVID is tremendous, especially when it comes to money. So the way that the people have taken up mobile money transfer and e-payments and e-commerce without any organized effort from the companies or from the operators or from the regulators or from the government, it's because the need was there. So the need was there. They developed this knowledge on their own. But I agree with you. Something should be done. The operators may need to have a bigger role on that. Maybe using the universal service funds that the operators are paying, because the fund is coming from the operators, not coming from the government. So the operators are paying a percentage of their revenue that's put in a fund, and then it's paid into this coverage. Maybe a small part of that could be used for education as well, because it's not that costly, but it needs a dedicated effort. So it needs to come into focus. So I agree with you.
Yeah, it's definitely, you get a lot of bang for your buck with these kind of programs. It's not like it's building a network and that kind of expense.
Yeah.
The other thing to add to Khalid, what you just said is and Chairman, earlier you talked about sort of the intersectionality of different issues. I mean, a better educated population is more likely to acquire digital skills.
Right. Yeah.
So, if a country has a higher level of, for example, secondary education attainment or beyond secondary education attainment, it's more likely that population will acquire more than just basic digital skills. And we do see that in the data.
Yeah, I think, thinking out of the box.
Yeah.
You see, if you've got a normalized commercial environment where mobile operators, through their service providers, as an incentive, having a training center, I take it that as and when I buy a mobile, one of the things that should be done, obviously from regulation, you take the user through the mobile phone itself, but in terms of its use, I agree with my colleagues when they talk about the usage of the Universal Service Fund, because there's an opportunity that some of the stores, I'm just going to be going back to basic, that imagine one of the service providers having a training facility where I come from a village. Every day I can walk in there. I can then be taken through in terms of use of a mobile unit and just be given the basic knowledge about a digitally enabled person. What are the basic things that I need to know about the gadgets that I use? And when you have this kind of schemes, I'm sure the mobile operators, if they come as regulators, as we've always said, we're looking at agility. I think it's something that is worth engaging to say, how best can we do that? Secondly, I mean, there are other parties that are not here. Education forms a very important part in what we're discussing today. So, and experience that we have in South Africa, we are now forging that as and when we have events of this nature, you must bring all the vertical sectors into our sector, because in most instances you'll find that we're talking to ourselves. So you need to have the consumers of our services as part of your audience, so that when you talk about what kind of training do you need to be digitally enabled, it will be interesting to hear how young ones, even the elderly, on how they define training. Because as an engineer myself here, I might be thinking, well, here's a phone, you can, but I think we need to change the mindset. Because when you talk of agility, regulator, smart, a smart regulator talks to users. It doesn't talk to those that knows what they are doing. And I think that's how we need to change. Just to, okay.
I just want to add a personal anecdote on this,
Sure.
on the skills as well, because I think one point you mentioned, Paul, earlier on, is that regulatory policy needs good data. And I think when I was working at CST, we worked with a lot of the big tech operators who are, in particular, Apple and Android, who are managing the mobile operating system ecosystem. And one of the findings that was uncovered by talking to them was that in Saudi Arabia, for example, that there was actually a lot of technical entrepreneurial instincts in devising apps, and it compared quite favorably with other countries, but there was a very poor ratio of those that were able to commercialize it. So less than 5% of those were making any money or knew how to make any money. So when we talk about digital skills, we always have this image of rural areas, people who are perhaps semi-literate, and don't understand phone, but it could be also people who are technically gifted at coding but don't understand aspects of how the digital ecosystem works.
Yeah, it's a complicated space, and there's a continuum of what that means. The other thing, just to also add this idea of digital ambassadors or digital navigators. So back on this idea of, you come into the shop and you buy the handset and someone sort of takes you through the journey. A lot of mobile network operators and other network operators are implementing what are called digital navigators programs, where you have employees of the company or community-based groups that they work with that are in the community, and they know the people around them, and they take the time to knock on the door and go see maybe their elderly neighbor and take her on the journey of digital skilling, just personally, one-to-one. And what we're seeing is that's sometimes far more effective than doing these sort of formal in the classroom kind of digital skilling programs.
Great. I think I'm getting the flashing red signal on the screens, which tells us our time is up. I want to thank esteemed panel, Paul Garrett, Khaled Hegasi, and Chairman Ramusi for sharing their insights from their many decades of experience as well. So,
yeah, please.
Yeah.
If you have
Unfortunately,
time.
we were told that there's no means for the audience to ask questions. We would love to have extended, but feel free to come and talk to the panelists directly as soon as this finishes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, this was nice.